The tragedy of U.S. membership in the United Nations. The United Nations is controlled by Afro-Asian nations, most of which sympathize with the Soviet Union, practically all of which reveal deep hostility toward the United States. A primitive African nation with fewer people than our smallest state has the same voting strength in the UN that we have. Of the 110 UN members, it is doubtful that 3 would stand with us against the Soviets on a critically dangerous issue. But the Communist and Afro-Asian blocs with 64 votes have a positive majority in the UN. Yet most of them pay nothing to support the UN while we pay the bills. With a sickly desire to show themselves friends of the emerging colored nations, our political leaders have opposed our real friends and have helped the United Nations foster race wars and race hatreds. That is a summary of my report on the tragedy of U.S. membership in the United Nations. The full report after a message from my sponsor. Well-informed constitutionalist Americans know that the United Nations Charter is a multi-nation treaty which, if obeyed by all parties to it, would require member nations to cooperate in socializing their national economies and then to merge into a unified worldwide socialist system. Creation of a world socialist system is the objective of communism. Thus, as created, the United Nations and all its specialized agencies are designed to serve the cause of communism. In many specific ways, the United Nations has promoted the interests of the Soviet Union. The United Nations and its specialized agencies provide diplomatic immunity to and a cover for Soviet secret police, spies, saboteurs, and propagandists to enter and travel in the United States. But the United Nations' primary service to the Soviet Union and its primary disservice to the United States have resulted from the weakness and folly, or treachery, of our own leaders. Having been brainwashed with the notion that, in the interests of world peace, all nations must be controlled by the decisions of an international Congress, United States officialdom has slavishly subjected itself to the designs of the United Nations, although no other government in the world does so. The result is that we, the greatest nation on earth, have no national policy. We try to handle the foreign affairs of our nation through United Nations agencies whose bills we pay, but in which we have one lone vote, a vote on a par with that of any little African nation of semi-savages or of a Soviet puppet state like Outer Mongolia. The United States directly pays 32% of administrative costs of the United Nations and of all its specialized agencies. Our share of the cost of United Nations special activities, the UN war in the Congo, for example, amounts to more than half of the total, and our voluntary contributions toward financing the programs of the specialized agencies, foreign aid programs of the United Nations Special Fund, for example, range upward of 40% of the total. If we consider that practically all nations, except the Soviet Union, which contribute anything at all to financing UN operations, get more than enough direct aid from the United States to offset their UN contributions, it is accurate to say that upward of 90% of all United Nations costs come eventually out of the paychecks of American taxpayers. Yet a primitive African nation containing fewer people than the smallest American state has the same voting strength in the UN that we have. It was during the Eisenhower administration, when 41 new nations were added to UN membership, that the balance of power in the UN shifted to African-Asian neutralist nations, most of which have displayed deep animosity toward the United States, sympathy for the Soviet Union. It would not be a welcome or pleasant sight, but would at least be understandable if the underdeveloped nations of Africa played the toady to us, fawning and wheedling to get our money and support. But the incredible fact is that we, the greatest nation in history, play the toady to them. Any representative from any new African nation, whose population may consist of a few 100,000 cannibals and Stone Age tribal groups, whose economy has been supported by our aid, and whose culture consists largely of decorations carved or burned on the faces of children, can threaten the United States and make demands on us, and we fearfully comply, lest the dark people on the earth think ill of us. The liberal leaders of America have become quite insane about the question of race. They appear to have a sense of shame about being white, At home, they will tear up the Constitution and undermine the liberties of the whole nation in order to support some cause sponsored by a pro-communist Negro organization. Abroad, they will take any insult and sacrifice the most vital interests of their own country to serve the underdeveloped colored people. The only nation in Africa which we consistently vote against in the United Nations is the only white Christian nation on that unhappy continent, the Republic of South Africa, an outpost of white civilization hemmed in by about 15 million blacks, most of them living in a state of semi-savagery. We insult and condemn the white South Africans and support the blacks. Aware of this psychosis, this suicidal tendency on the part of our liberal political leaders, let's take a look at the present balance of power in the United Nations. The UN now has 110 members. They are generally listed broadly in blocks to indicate basic political alignment. The Afro-Asian bloc nations are 52 in number, Western bloc 25, Latin American bloc 21, Communist bloc 12. The Communist bloc is truly a bloc, controlled by the Soviet Union, with an occasional straying by Yugoslavia to keep alive the fiction of Yugoslavian independence, and thus to keep American money flowing to this communist satellite. The Communist bloc alone can outvote us 12-1. The Afro-Asian bloc is not so totally controlled as the Communist bloc, but it sticks together as a unit on most significant issues, and it generally supports the Soviet Union. The Afro-Asian nations are seldom, if ever, on the side of the United States in an issue of major importance unless the United States and the Soviet Union are on the same side. Of the 52 nations in the Afro-Asian bloc, at least 5 can correctly be called communist, since they are controlled by communists or by men like Sukarno of Indonesia, who is, for all practical purposes, a communist. The Communist bloc and Afro-Asian bloc constitute a positive voting majority in the United Nations. They can and will outvote us on any issue of real importance if we should take a position harmful to communism. Yet we pay the UN bills. They pay little or nothing. The Western bloc of nations in the UN are ostensibly our staunch allies. Among them are major European nations who have been deeply offended by American support of communist movements which dismembered their colonial empires. Also among our staunch UN allies are Canada, offended by recent State Department meddling in Canadian domestic politics, Finland under the thumb of the Soviet Union, Greece steadily moving toward the position of communism in international disputes, Iceland, pro-communist, strongly anti-United States, Israel, providing training for the armies of the communist dictator of Ghana, Italy, with the biggest communist party outside the Soviet Union, currently engaging in a program of nationalizing, that is, communizing major industries, South Africa, deeply offended by our treatment of her in the United Nations. Of our 24 staunch allies in the Western bloc of the United Nations, I doubt that there are 3 which would support us on any critically dangerous issue. The United Nations, a peace organization, is propagating race wars and race hatreds. Its activities are fostering the racist concept of colored supremacy, inflaming primitive colored peoples to savage hatred of white men, encouraging and supporting them in atrocities which are not merely indescribable but loathsome to contemplate. Communists supply the leadership for horrible uprisings and mass carnage in Africa, and the Soviets support the leaders as native patriots. The United Nations praises and aids the butchery under the pretense that it is a wholesome expression of yearning for national independence. United States officialdom finances the UN communist operation with our money and gives it the moral support of our nation. Dr. Max Jurgen, prominent American Negro scholar, says, quote, "The United States has followed the leader behind the Soviet Union in promoting the tragedy of Africa. The purpose, our spokesman explained, is to improve the image of America among emerging nations and win their friendship. As an American and a Negro, my sympathies have always been with African aspirations for freedom, but I am increasingly appalled by the kind of demagoguery, largely manipulated by Moscow and Peking, that delivers African populations to chaos and communism in the name of national sovereignty. The United States, in siding almost automatically with the extremists, has made itself the captive of red propaganda and has thus aided communism in Africa. The United States has aligned itself with communists, anti-white racists, witch doctors, and the reversion to cannibalism, end quote. That quotation was from Dr. Max Jurgen, a prominent American Negro scholar. He was speaking especially about African Angola, where conditions are even more horrible than in the Congo, worse even than conditions in Kenya a few years ago during the Mau Mau reign of terror. In Angola, the United States, through the United Nations, is supporting, with money and influence, cannibalistic savagery almost beyond the comprehension of civilized men. Our honor as a nation has already been so deeply stained by Kennedy-supported United Nations policies in Angola that the blot will remain forever. Next week, I will give details on this situation. Suffice it now to say that our only hope for a return to decency with regard to policy in Africa is by withdrawing the United States from membership in the United Nations. Even if we had an administration in Washington determined to pursue a sane and honorable policy, it would fail. The Afro-Asian and communist blocs in the United Nations are inflexibly fixed on the present course, and they can outvote us 64-1 even while we pay the bills. By getting out of the United Nations and refusing to pay its bills, we would render a great service to Africa. Neither the communist nor the Afro-Asian nations would or could pay for the UN operations now dragging Africa backward to cannibalism under communist control. I am Dan Smoot. Goodbye. God bless you. For a printed copy of this broadcast, send 25 cents to Dan Smoot, Dallas 14, Texas, and ask for $3.99. The Tragedy of U.S. Membership in the United Nations. 6 copies, $1.